Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, A Closer Look at Economic Mobility. I'm Sandra Fischel Booth, Director of Grant Making at the Winston-Salem Foundation, and on behalf of the Foundation, I want to thank you for joining us. Over the past 7 years, the Winston-Salem Foundation has been deeply focused on equitable wealth building, education, and career mobility. These areas are central to our mission of increasing economic mobility and building a vibrant, sustainable community where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Our work has been shaped in large part by Dr. Raj Chetty's groundbreaking 2014 study, which helped to shine a light on the complex factors that influence economic mobility. His research has been a powerful guide for us. We were thrilled to welcome Dr. Chetty to Winston-Salem for a community meeting in May, and today we're excited to keep that conversation going. Joining us are two incredible speakers. First, we have David Forte, Director of Research, Translation, and Strategic Initiatives at Opportunity Insights at Harvard. David's work focuses on turning research into real-world strategies that communities can use to make a difference. He'll be joined by Adam Hill, Executive Director of Forsyth Futures, our trusted local data partner, who brings deep insights into the trends and challenges right here in Forsyth County. During the next hour, David will briefly recap some of the key insights from Opportunity Insights research and then highlight promising policy examples in areas of housing, workforce development, and social capital. We know that as a community, we're eager to build on the great work already underway and keep that momentum going. That's why we're especially grateful to have Adam with us to share how our community is being galvanized by collective action and to give us a closer look at some of the exciting opportunities happening right here in Forsyth County. We hope today's conversation sparks new ideas, deepens your understanding, and inspires all of us to think about how we can work together to create more opportunities for everyone in Forsyth County. Thanks again for being here. After we've heard from David and Adam, we'll have some time reserved for Q&A, so please enter your questions into the chat as you listen. With that, let's dive in. I'm excited to hand it over to David to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sandra, and thank you to the Foundation for having us here today to talk more with you about the research at Opportunity Insights. So my name is David Forte, as Sandra mentioned. I lead our research translation work at Opportunity Insights, and we are a research to policy lab based at Harvard University, and our team focuses on the topic of economic mobility, and they study this using a big data approach. So using large-scale administrative data sets like US Census, tax records, private sector data from groups like Meta or Facebook, which allows our team to look at population-level data to really understand what economic mobility looks like across America, and also to understand the mechanisms or the factors that are at play in contributing to rates of upward mobility in communities across the US. So today, we're going to recap some of the research and the discussion that Professor Chetty brought to your community recently in the past few months. But I wanted to highlight this one illustration and note-taking piece that came out of that event. I thought this was really cool. And also just to pull out a few things that stood out to me and topics that we can revisit today and go a little bit deeper on. So the first was around how opportunity varies across the US and locally within places. The second was around how opportunity is changing. So we'll talk a bit more about the trends there and what's at play and contributing to those factors. The power of community. So Sandra mentioned social capital. I think this is a really important theme that we'll dive a bit more into. Other characteristics from communities, whether it be related to housing, transportation, school quality, other facets that kind of shape what opportunity looks like within a place. And then finally, the policy examples that Professor Chetty spoke to, we'll dive a bit more into those today related to segregation and housing, place-based investments, and as well as the role of higher education and workforce development. So kudos to the illustrator for this. That was just a really cool capture of the event. Okay, so we'll start off with the geography of opportunity, thinking about what rates of upward mobility look like in the US. So this may be a map that is familiar to folks, especially those who attended Professor Chetty's talk. But what this is showing here is the average household income in adulthood for children who grew up in low-income families. So importantly, we're controlling for the household financial circumstances of the kids growing up in these families. And then what we see when we look forward into the data in time is that the financial futures of those children, although they started in the same place financially as a household, the outcomes vary tremendously across the U.S. So areas where we see red and orange in the U.S., these are lower rates of upward mobility, oftentimes declining mobility between generations. And places where we see blue and green represent areas of the U.S. where low-income children tend to have better outcomes later in life. And so we can see Winston-Salem here highlighted as having an average of $27,000 for low-income children growing up in your community. But what's really unique and important about this data that our team works with is you're able to zoom in locally, neighborhood by neighborhood within a place to understand how local patterns and neighborhood variation plays out. So the first thing I'll point out here is that in the bottom right, the scale that we use to describe the national patterns, that's also the same scale that we're using to describe the local patterns within the Winston-Salem area. And so you can see that depending on which side of the town you're growing up in, you can have dramatically different outcomes for low-income children just based on where they're growing up, the communities they're exposed to, the experiences that they have, schools that they go to. So this can be the same as growing up in, on average, a place in the southeast in the U.S., say Mississippi, versus growing up in a place in the Midwest like Iowa or Utah or the West Coast. So local patterns and local variation is very important, I think, as we're thinking about policy and what we can do to shape rates of upward mobility for residents within communities. Okay, so that was a look at kind of the geography of opportunity. What are the patterns we're seeing locally? Another way that the team at Opportunity Insights has looked at this data is thinking about how opportunity is shifting between generations. How static is this concept of opportunity? And part of the motivation for this work was, thinking back to historic policies. So here I've inserted a redlining map from the Winston-Salem area in contrast to the rates of upward mobility that we just looked at. And what you can see is just these patterns are very similar, right? These historic policies that were shaping communities and how folks, lived and where they lived, what access they had to in terms of home ownership and financial opportunities. These continue to play out in rates of upward mobility locally and nationally that we see across the US. So the question the team had was really to understand, to what extent can opportunity change, and what does that look like nationally and at the local level? So here we're looking at a very similar map nationally to what we looked at initially. This is rates of upward mobility for low-income children born in 1978. And just through the gift of time, what our team was able to do was go forward 15 years or so to children born in 1992 to understand how those rates of mobility differed between those two birth cohorts. How has place shifted in terms of the rates of upward mobility that it can offer? And what we can see here just at a broad level, especially I think if we highlight certain areas of the US to focus in on, you can see that opportunity deteriorated broadly across the US between these two time periods that we studied. And what we saw was that the largest changes were actually for that of white and Black children. So I'll show a few visuals here that explain that experience a bit more. We didn't see as much variation nationally for other subgroups. So I'll focus on those two just to illustrate the changes we did see. So here, the same map, but for white children born in 1978. And then if we go forward, what you can see is a much more pronounced deterioration of opportunity across the US, so much more red on the right-hand side of the map versus the left. So low-income children from white families tended to have poorer outcomes between these 2 years that we studied. And switching over to the experience for low-income Black children, first you'll notice that there's a color change here, and that'll become evident in just a moment why we did that. But again, painting the picture for children born in 1978 versus those in 1992. And what we see is the opposite trajectory or trend. So we saw broad improvements in rates of upward mobility for low-income Black children between these two time periods. And this is where the color change comes into effect. So if we juxtapose the experience for low-income Black children versus low-income white children from the 1992 birth cohort, what we see is that the best places in America for a low-income Black child to grow up still are not on par in terms of the rates of upward mobility that we're seeing for the worst experience for low-income white children. So we have two essentially non-overlapping distributions between these two subgroups. So even though we're seeing a narrowing of the rates of upward mobility and that gap that we see in incomes later in life, it's still quite a substantial gap between these two groups. Okay. I've included a few additional visuals here of the broader Winston-Salem area. It's a little bit fuzzy as we zoom in, but again, painting the picture for the experience for low-income white children, that for low-income Black children. Again, we see these same trends that we saw nationally playing out locally. And then again, as we juxtapose those two next to each other, we can see the broad gap that still exists between the outcomes for low-income Black and children. And I think one of the things that we often are faced with when we see these two opposing trends, excuse me, is that the question of, is there a trade-off happening, right? Is this a zero-sum game where one group is benefiting at the expense of another? And so we can go into the data and actually test this by plotting the change for one group. Horizontally here, we have the change in average household income for low-income white children between those 2 years. And vertically, we have the change for low-income Black children. And so just by plotting those two next to each other, we can see that we have as a positive relationship. And Forsyth County here is highlighted as to where they fall. So this is to say that the places where low-income Black children had the best outcomes, the places in the top of the graph, are also the places where the deterioration of opportunity for low-income white children during this time period was the least, right? So if this was a zero-sum game where there was a trade-off happening, what we would see is actually a negative sloping line here, which is just not the case in the data that we analyzed. And here I've plotted a few kind of peer communities just to show again how this relationship plays out place by place. Okay, so we focused a lot on the experience of low-income white and Black children. And I mentioned that nationally we didn't see much change happening for other subgroups. I think that is something that through the data tools that we'll talk about in a moment, you can go in and actually look specifically community by community, how things were shifting for other race and ethnicity groups. So for instance, within Forsyth County, you see here that the Hispanic population saw a marked improvement between the two birth cohorts of 78 and 92. So this is in contrast to what we saw nationally, where there was relatively zero change. So I think importantly, you can zoom in and understand the unique changes to your community, which may be different in some cases than what we saw nationally. Okay, so shifting over now to the characteristics, the broader characteristics of high opportunity areas, going back to the map of Winston-Salem, particularly we're trying to understand what are the characteristics of blue areas that make them higher opportunity relative to the areas of the map that are red. And the four characteristics that our team has uncovered are lower poverty rates. So where we see less poverty concentration tends to be areas of higher rates of mobility. More stable family structures. So the increased presence of two-parent households within a community tends to matter quite a bit. Not so much that you as a low-income child are growing up in a two-parent household, but that the broader community you're exposed to has more two-parent households within it. Better school quality, both from a K-12 quality experience, and then also in terms of your access to high-quality post-secondary options. And then finally, greater social capital, which we'll spend a bit more time on here. Our team in the past few years did a deeper dive into this topic through a partnership with Facebook data, looking at who's friends with whom, right? And so the biggest outcome to come from this research was this concept of economic connectedness. And that is the extent to which high and low income individuals are forming meaningful relationships with one another. And we can decompose this into two different factors. So on one side, we have this concept of exposure or segregation. How socioeconomically integrated is a community? Are there high and low income folks in the same place with one another? And then on the other side of that, we have this concept of friending or friending bias. And so this looks at, given a level of exposure within the place, how likely is it that high and low income folks are forming meaningful relationships with one another? Are they doing so, or are they continuing to kind of self-segregate, live near each other, but not necessarily associating or forming those relationships? So these two together contribute to the outcome of economic connectedness. And we're spending a bit more time on this particular characteristic because this is the strongest predictor that our team has found to date in the research that shows what rates of upward mobility look like within places. So we can look at that nationally right here between these two maps. So on the left, we're looking at the same map we've been looking at nationally around rates of upward mobility based on US tax records. And on the right-hand side, we have economic connectedness based on Facebook data. And I think just visually what you can see here is that these two maps are very similar. So places where we have much higher rates of economic connectedness, cross-class connections happening within places. These are also places that tend to foster much stronger, much higher rates of upward mobility in the US. And then again, as we zoom into the data, because of just the large scale administrative data our team is using, we can zoom in here to the zip code level. And for the Winston-Salem area, what we can see just visually again is a similarity between the two, where we see higher rates of mobility. We also tend to see higher rates of economic connectedness and vice versa. And this is something you can explore for any community within the US. Okay, so just to switch over now to kind of talking more about the policy examples, I wanted to give you just a sense of how folks are starting to think about this topic of economic connectedness and apply it in real world examples. So on the left-hand side here, we have the example of a high school in Dallas, Texas, Lake Highlands High School. And when they developed their high school initially, they constructed two different cafeterias within the school. So one that served free and reduced lunch, one that did not. And so mechanically, the students were being segregated at lunchtime into students from low-income backgrounds receiving free and reduced lunch, and then students who brought their lunch or bought their lunch elsewhere. So school realized this, identified it as a problem area for them, reconstructed the school, reimagined it through an architecture firm, and developed a common cafeteria, as well as rethinking the common spaces within the school so that they could foster more opportunity for students to interact with one another. So here, I think the issue they were trying to address was more on the friending side. They had the exposure within the school with families and students from high and low income backgrounds, but mechanically they were separated. And so the opportunity to create those bonds across class lines was really limited or hindered. On the right-hand side, we have this example from Atlanta, Georgia, where the local transit there, the MARTA system, partnered with a nonprofit focused on soccer and sport. And so in the small graph here, I have plotted the different MARTA stops, the little train stops within the Atlanta area. You can't quite see that, but we'll share these slides afterwards. You can zoom more into that. But what you'll notice in looking at that is that the stops span between high and low opportunity areas. And what this partnership did was create soccer fields stop by stop at each of these stops throughout Atlanta, and then formed soccer teams based on proximity to your local stop. So you could imagine, let's say, a team from North Atlanta using the MARTA system, traveling to South or Western Atlanta, where there's relatively lower opportunity, playing against a team that's based there, and potentially creating these opportunities for folks to interact that otherwise didn't exist. So I think here they're tackling kind of both of these sides of the equation, but I think more the exposure side, where they're trying to bring communities together that otherwise would have been separated. Okay, so these are just a couple of examples of how folks are thinking about this concept of economic connectedness. I wanted to also touch briefly on three different policy approaches that we've seen in the research to promote rates of upward mobility. So the first focused on reducing segregation and helping low-income families access areas of higher opportunity within the community that they live. So here I've plotted the 25 most common census tracts or neighborhoods where families with housing choice vouchers live within the Winston-Salem area. And I think what you'll notice here as you're looking at this just visually is that all of these dots are located in areas of relatively lower opportunity within the city. And this is a pattern that I think as we look at housing choice voucher lease up within the United States and just community by community, this is something that plays out in other places as well. So here we have an example from Seattle, Washington. Again, you'll notice these dots are predominantly located in lower opportunity areas of the city. And the housing authorities in the Seattle-King County area, when we released this data through the Opportunity Atlas, identified this, worked with us to create a simple kind of programmatic intervention that looked at education around what opportunity looks like within the broader Seattle area, as well as paired with some case management services and navigation, just kind of smoothing the process with the landlords to allow them to access these areas of higher opportunity should they want to do so. And what we saw in this study was really high rates of success. So families who were enrolled in the program with these additional supports tended to move to areas of higher opportunity at much higher rates. This has been since replicated in the top right here through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, their Community Choice Demonstration Project, which is taking the CMTO program that was in Seattle, replicating it in various places throughout the U.S. to understand in what ways this is transferable and scalable to other communities. They just came out with a kind of a mid-year study on this, and the outcomes that they're seeing are extremely positive and very similar to what we saw in Seattle. So that's encouraging to see as a potential area of replication and scale. Elements of this program also have made its way into other bills that are working their way through Congress, increasing the number of vouchers available for this sort of programming, as well as other language that indicates the type of services that should be provided to allow this type of intervention to work better. Okay, so that was around geographic choice and thinking about how we can move families to places of opportunity. The other side of that coin, I think, is not everyone should be moving from their neighborhood to go find opportunity. How can we think about improving opportunity within neighborhoods where low-income residents currently reside? So our team has been working, and we'll be releasing a little bit later this year, a paper on the Hope 6 neighborhood revitalization program. So this, for folks who are not familiar, was a HUD program in the late 90s, billions of dollars worth of investment to identify older public housing projects, typically those that have very high poverty concentration within an area, to deconstruct them and reimagine the architecture, much oftentimes lower profile. In some communities, you'll think of kind of high rises where public housing exists. Reimagine the architecture, create more opportunity for mixed income housing within a place, as opposed to concentrating low-income residents in one place together. So again, going back to that concept of social capital and how it's interplaying with upward mobility. And so our team has been analyzing this, and we'll be releasing a study later this year to understand how these types of revitalization projects and just community redevelopment can be thought about in terms of shaping rates of upward mobility for low-income residents where they currently live. So that's one example. Another is just place-based kind of grassroots initiatives, and we're seeing two promising examples from the communities of Charlotte and Philadelphia. Charlotte, on one hand, when we first released our study on upward mobility in the US back in 2014, Charlotte was ranked 50th out of 50 in terms of large metro areas and their prospects for low-income children growing up in that community. And so this motivated a lot of action within the community. They didn't see themselves necessarily as 50th out of 50. They thought of themselves as a vibrant, economically thriving and growing community. So this was challenging for them to receive, and in some ways also was a recognition for folks who were doing work in communities that understood their residents well. So this motivated investments from private and public sector groups. We saw millions of dollars being invested here in economic mobility initiatives. There was also an organization formed, Leading on Opportunity, that served as kind of a local backbone organization. They organized and kind of helped distribute these funds in a coordinated way. They also developed local measurement tools that really helped the community and the various partners that were involved in this work continue to monitor and stay involved in how the community was doing as a whole. More recently in Philadelphia, we saw, as we released our Changing Opportunity paper this past 2 years ago now, Philadelphia was ranked 50th out of 50 in terms of rates of change between those two birth years that we talked about, 78 and 92. So we saw the most deterioration in opportunity in the broader Philadelphia region during those two time periods. And this also sparked a lot of interest from local leaders and public and private sector groups. We saw $20 million worth of investment recently being put into workforce training programs within the Philadelphia area. So this is very much an active partnership that's happening right now. So we're excited to see and monitor how this plays out. But I think importantly, across these two examples, we're seeing cross-sector collaboration being pointed at this outcome of economic mobility and addressing it in a variety of different ways. Okay. And the last policy example I wanted to touch on was the role of higher education and workforce training. So we'll start with higher education. And this chart here, each dot on the graph represents a college within the United States. And so we can think of the university system's contribution to upward mobility along two dimensions. So horizontally, we have low-income access. You can think of this as the proportion of low-income students that are enrolled at a given university. And then vertically, we have rates of upward mobility. So for those graduates, how likely are they to move from the bottom 20% from a low-income family to the top 20%? And so what we see when we look at this is that in the bottom right, we have a lot of schools, a few highlighted here in orange, that serve the vast majority of our low-income students, but the prospects for those students post-graduation aren't extremely strong. And then on the other side of this graph, we see highly selective universities represented here in the green that don't enroll a whole lot of low-income students, but they provide really strong outcomes for those low-income students who do enroll in those schools. And I think the problem as we think of their contribution, the university system's contribution at large to upward mobility, is that we just don't see a whole lot of universities on the upper right-hand corner of this graph, right? You have to both have access and provide strong outcomes to be an engine of upward mobility in the US. We do see a few examples that I think we can learn from, the Vaughn College of Aeronautics and Technology being one of those. And as you might imagine, this is a very particular kind of training program that is in a very specific field that has jobs that are quite high paying. So doing a good job of enrolling students, having a focused training program that puts those graduates directly into a specific career pathway that has a strong income to begin with. I plotted here also area schools in North Carolina, just as a reference. And again, we'll share these slides afterwards so you can take a peek at this and understand how if you're working with a local university, how they rate along these two dimensions. Okay, and then as far as workforce development goes, I think a common question communities have, and one that the community of Charlotte had, was, well, if we have really strong job growth within our region, doesn't that translate into rates of upward mobility for our residents? And what we've done here, as we released the Opportunity Atlas paper, was try to address that question and why we see such broad variation in the US. So horizontally, left to right, we have the rates of job growth rates between the years of 1990 and 2010. And then vertically, we have that outcome of upward mobility that we looked at in those national maps of what the average income in adulthood for low-income children is within each community. And I think the key pattern here is that there really isn't an association. There's no correlation between these two. You have communities like Charlotte and Atlanta in the bottom right that have really strong job growth within this time period that we studied, but offered their residents growing up in low-income families really, really low outcomes relative to other communities. So I think the question here is, well, what's happening, right? If we have all these jobs that are being brought in or that are being created, why don't we see that translating into rates of upward mobility? And what we think is happening largely is that these communities are importing talent. They're creating these high-paying jobs, but they're not going to the residents of those communities for a variety of reasons, right? Maybe it's around training, maybe it's around the ability to navigate the job market and gain access to these positions. But one promising intervention that we've seen is through a specific type of workforce training. So this is for folks who aren't familiar, Year Up is a sectoral job training program, and they provide training for their participants, but also provide connections for those participants to employers from communities that have jobs available. And we did an analysis of this program, compared to a control group, and we were able to understand the impact of this program specifically. So in the yellow here, we have participants, so in both of these lines, we have a similar group of participants. They are from the same neighborhood, or they share the same racial background and composition. So these are two representative groups. The only difference is that one participated in the Year Up program and another group did not. And so what we can see for those that did not in the control is that their income continued to increase. But relative to the folks who did participate, we didn't see this jump in earnings. And in fact, what we see is about a $9,000 a year growth in earnings relative to the control group. And this outcome is sustained over time. So this training program is really improving earnings, but then also sustaining them. And a large part of this is not just because of the training, right? It's because of the connections and the social capital components that this program offered to its participants to be able to connect them to these jobs within a place. So investment in human capital, but also that social capital component to make this program particularly successful. Okay, and with that, I will wrap up. I wanted to close on just highlighting some of the data tools that our team has made available, where you can go in and explore the data that we looked at here on these slides in a dynamic way. So the first is the Opportunity Atlas. This allows you to look community by community at rates of upward mobility down to the census tract level, and also compare those changes between those two birth cohorts that we talked about. The Social Capital Atlas in the center here, this allows you to look at the outcome of economic connectedness and then compare that to rates of upward mobility within the tool. So you can see, also decomposing between the concept of exposure and friending and really understand, well, what's happening within my community. This can also be looked at through the lens of high schools and colleges, so you can understand within that student body what's going on in terms of shaping this outcome. And then the mobility report cards in the far right. So this is looking at that data that we looked at in that graph of colleges in terms of access and outcomes. You can type in essentially any university in the US and explore those outcomes within a tool that was developed by the New York Times. And then also our research papers. So these are publicly available tools, but they're also accompanied by a series of research papers with lots of different resources on a variety of topics related to upward mobility. So I encourage you to check those out. And then as you're digging into the data and have questions or thinking about how to apply it in your community, or just want to talk about how you use the Opportunity Atlas, we offer virtual office hours at Opportunity Insights, and you can sign up for those using the Calendly link that's provided here. We're happy to talk more with you about the data, the research, or any questions you might have. All right, so with that, I will conclude my portion of the webinar today. I hope I didn't go too far over time. And I will pass it over to Adam.
Righty. Thanks, David. I think you helped provide lots of great information. I think the primary goal that I have for my time today is to, I think David provided great information. So I'd really love to help people identify ways that they can, plug in, apply what they're learning, and be engaged in, promoting change and action within our community related to these issues. So that is my primary goal. So I first wanted to, talk through an emerging initiative called Thriving Together. This is built off of the Vital Conditions Framework, which this framework is really all about, what are the conditions that all of the people in our community would need to thrive. And today I'm specifically going to talk about some action that's being taken in the community related to the lifelong learning and humane housing vital conditions, because I think that most closely connects to some things that David lifted up. And the work of Thriving Together really is all about how do we better align and coordinate, all the great work we're doing as a community. So we're really maximizing our resources to improve outcomes across these conditions. I think we have had lots of great efforts in our community, but haven't always been great at making sure that we're connecting across all the different work that's happening. So this year, a lot of the work that Thriving Together is focusing on is launching networks in the the lifelong learning and the humane housing spaces. And then really exploring how we can partner with other groups who are doing great work in some of these other conditions: meaningful wealth and work, basic needs for health and safety, and thriving natural world. I'm going to go more in depth about some of the things that are happening within the lifelong learning space in an emerging network called Forsyth Family Power, and then the housing network as well. Another major thing that we are working on in Thriving Together is really increasing more visibility and awareness of all the great work that's happening. Again, I think half the battle is just knowing what's going on. So really working to build out communication platforms so that there's increased awareness of who's doing what, how can we better collaborate and really align in moving outcomes across these conditions. So the first body of work I wanted to lift up is called Forsyth Family Power. This is an emerging network. It's really focused in that lifelong learning space. This, for those of you who have been around a while, there was an initiative called Forsyth Promise. So this is really the next iteration of that work. And it's really all about how do we work collectively as a community towards having a common action plan to improve outcomes for children and youth within our community. This year, the work is really focused on, we have lots of great networks, and I'm going to lift up some of those on the next slide. How do we identify, the various strategies we're working on as a community across these networks and major organizations who are in the education space? And how are we really all working towards improving outcomes across that birth to career continuum? Really identifying, who's working on kindergarten readiness, who's working on third grade reading, who's working on post-secondary attainment and career readiness, so that we can better coordinate, align our activities, and really be working on common strategies to moving the needle, improving outcomes for children and youth. Another major thing we're doing is making sure that we're bringing youth and parents into the process of really determining, what we prioritize as a community in terms of action, and that really having them help drive kind of our community plan. As I said, I think one of the places we're starting is working with the existing networks that are in place. So we do have an interim leadership table to get this work back off the ground this year. These networks are all across that cradle to career continuum. We have groups like the Pre-K Priority working on improving access and quality to pre-K. Forsyth County for grade level reading is really working on coordinated strategies to improve third grade reading outcomes. So we're wanting to engage those who are already actively doing work to build a more kind of cohesive community action plan as it relates to improving education outcomes. We're also making sure that we're engaging major systems and systems leaders in getting this work back off the ground. So we're engaging the Greater Winston-Salem Inc., Forsyth Tech, and the school system. So what are ways for people to, plug into this work as we're building out that cohesive community action plan that's comprised of the work that's already happening across networks and major organizations in our community? So there was actually a community conversation last Saturday, but there's a couple more coming up. Really to engage community in a conversation of helping shape, the vision for our future for children and youth in Forsyth County, and this is all this that's shared here will very much feed into the Forsyth Family Power work. So here is one way, if you're interested in getting engaged in the education space, a couple upcoming community conversations that we will be having. And there's a QR code there. So if you want to take a picture and that will bring you to able to register for these different upcoming events. I'm going quick because I think we only have a few more minutes. Also wanted to lift up work that's happening in the housing space. There is an emerging housing network. There's been a few meetings related to this network. This work is all about building a coalition of residents, community groups, funders, housing professionals, and leaders across the housing ecosystem, really working towards building a community-wide housing plan that's rooted in kind of community voice and residents. There is an upcoming network meeting September 4th. So if you're interested in getting involved in this work, the things that the network is actively exploring is opportunities to take action in a number of different areas across, the housing ecosystem work, all the way from, the urgency end and related to issues around homelessness to the stability and thriving end of the housing continuum, really around home ownership and wealth building. So this network is really looking at how do we advance outcomes across that whole housing continuum. So if you're interested in being engaged in this housing network, there is a QR code there to register for the upcoming meeting. And then I think I saw Stephen in the room in terms of participants. Stephen Sills is engaged in this work and is helping gather information about what have we done in the past related to housing, and how can we learn from that to help inform the future of our work related to improving housing outcomes. And I have a QR code of the video of that, and then there's also the report. Okay, the last thing I wanted to lift up is the city and county have developed a Forward 2045 plan that includes lots of the interventions or strategies that I think David lifted up that other communities are pursuing to improve economic mobility. So here's the link to the overall plan, but I did just wanted to lift up some specific strategies that are included in that plan that are directly connected to some things David talked about. So one of them being increasing upward economic mobility by improving access to workforce development, training, and educational programs for residents, being in kind of that economic development or career opportunity space. And then some housing related strategies that are included in that plan are prioritizing and incentivizing development for affordable housing in neighborhoods with access to high performing schools, workplaces, grocery stores, and other services. And then another goal is really around how do we create more mixed neighborhoods from an income standpoint in terms of how we're thinking about housing development. So again, here, that's just a few of the things that are in here. There's many things in here. This plan was approved last fall, and so I think it is very much in early stages and very much needs community input and engagement in the process. And directly related to that, there's some upcoming public input meetings that the city and county are hosting. There's one even tonight, but over the next week, to get community input about what things from this plan should be prioritized, and how should we really be looking and thinking about zoning, so that we don't have much more space as a community, so we really need to think about density and to really get at affordable housing issues. So this is a way to immediately plug in and get involved and be part of the conversation related to things we're doing in the housing space. So that was a kind of a quick whirlwind, but I wanted to just lift up some immediate ways that people could apply their learning from what David shared into spaces that are actively having these conversations in our community. And I will share these slides so you can get access to all these QR codes that I shared to get involved because I went pretty quickly. So I think I'm handing back to Sandra to lift up some questions.
Yeah, thank you, David and Adam, for those insights. We're going to jump right into Q&A. David, advancing these policy strategies that you mentioned, like building mixed income housing, often require increased public will and support. Have you come across any effective practices or approaches that help communities embrace and implement these kinds of changes?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, it takes a lot of public will to often embark on any of these kinds of policies or community initiatives, especially ones that require, redevelopment of communities and that sort of thing. So I can offer two examples, I think, of instances where I've seen this happening and working well. So again, drawing on the experience from Charlotte, North Carolina, the group that I mentioned, Leading on Opportunity. So they were positioned within the community as really an organizing and education kind of group that would share issues of economic mobility and the research behind it with the broader community, but also receive a lot of input, similar to the community meetings that Adam was just highlighting, around what the priorities were for residents within the broader Charlotte area, so that they weren't just developing these initiatives or policies within a vacuum as what they thought was best, but it was really community-led and grassroots oriented, which I think contributed greatly to the impact and success that they've been able to have in their community. Another example that I'll highlight is one that takes a little bit of a different approach. So Leading an Opportunity was a nonprofit entity in the community of Pima County in Arizona. There was an initiative, still an initiative now, called the Prosperity Initiative. And it is a broad public initiative to address economic mobility through a variety of different programmatic lanes. And they developed this based on the evidence and research, and was very data informed, well-researched effort as a whole. But it was brought to the local governments. So thinking about the county as a whole, it was brought to the individual local governments within Pima County, as well as the tribal groups, to really get input and feedback that could help shape and take ownership of that work. So I think, again, you're getting the buy-in of local leaders was really critical in having that work well. And I'll share just in the chat a link that folks can access on our website to explore these examples and a few others if they're interested.
Thanks, David. Those are really great examples, and I think we're well set up with Thriving Together to move some of those forward. I'm also wondering, when we talk about improving economic mobility, arts programming and other extracurricular activities aren't always part of the conversation. Can you help us understand how these enrichment opportunities contribute to economic mobility and why they matter?
Yeah, I think that's really important, right? I think the outcome of economic mobility, it's something that no single organization necessarily owns, right? It's not in your annual report, you don't report on your statistics related to how you did on upward mobility. You're thinking about other issues, right, around grade level performance, or the number of meals distributed, or things that you can quantify in a much more readily available way. So I think, as a community, being able to position organizations that work on different issues and orient them towards collectively this outcome of economic mobility that you might seek as a community is really important. So taking an arts program, for example, what is after school art and exploration around pottery or painting have to do necessarily with rates of upward mobility? I think one area you could point to is around social capital, thinking about who is enrolled in those programs, who is that made available for, what is the composition of the young people who are participating in that, and are we seeing folks from different neighborhoods, different backgrounds coming together in this program to engage in this activity that they share in common together, potentially forming those relationships that we were talking about across class lines? Or is it more of an exclusive program, right? That's maybe there's a fee for entry where only families from higher income backgrounds can access. So I think that's one way to think about individual contributions as it relates to the broader community goal of upward mobility.
Yeah, I think there's definitely opportunity there for building a lot of social capital. So thank you for that. I'm also wondering, as someone who's actively applying research to strategy, what are some key factors that people often overlook, but that are essential to driving economic mobility?
Yeah, I think one thing we didn't touch on the slides today that we went over was this concept of exposure from a duration standpoint. I think this is something that's quite important to the research. So this is the idea that the longer you spend as a child in a neighborhood that offers more opportunity, higher rates of opportunity and mobility, the more of an effect that has on your outcomes later in life. So this is the theme of kind of investing early in children and having that play out during the entirety of their childhood. So what we see is that if a child, for instance, just from a moving standpoint, think geographically, if their family moves from a low opportunity to a high opportunity area, say at age 2, what we see is that 2-year-old tends to exhibit the outcomes of children who grew up in this high opportunity area much more so than if they were to move, say, at age 16 or 17 when they're entering the labor market, right? Or about to kind of embark on adulthood. So starting early in terms of shaping the community that a child is exposed to really tends to matter quite a bit. And then I think the other point I would touch on is focusing on community indicators. And we talked about this in the characteristics component. I think often as social programs, you can think of, you know, your recipient being a family or an individual, right, and trying to improve their outcomes. But I think what our research is really pointing to is that if you focus on broader community conditions, that has a tremendous impact on the low-income residents who are growing up in that community. You don't necessarily have to address the needs, although you should in other ways, right? But as a community, focusing on the broader community conditions that these families are exposed to in the neighborhoods where they live, socialize, educate their kids, those factors can have a tremendous impact on children's outcomes.
Thank you. That's really helpful. David, I think we have a couple of minutes left before we close out. I'm just sort of curious, so I'm throwing this out there. Are there ever questions you wish people would ask you about economic mobility, but they sort of don't?
Gosh. What's a good question that folks ask but don't, or would ask but don't often ask? I don't know. I mean, I think the theme of social capital is just one that's often curious to folks, but don't necessarily know how to approach it. I think thinking of the theme of friending, for instance, you know, how do you create more friendships, right? And what does that look like within the place? I don't think we have really strong evidence yet on how, on the mechanisms behind what shapes friending patterns. It's something our team is definitely working on, but I think I would point those types of questions back to the folks in communities who are working on these issues, because I think you just have such a stronger, richer sense of your community and residents, and just testing things out, right? If we think of that after school arts program, how can we think about that as a resource for improving friending and economic connectedness across class lines? I think it's a big area of exploration still in the field.
Thanks. So David and Adam, I'm going to point this question to both of you as we wrap up, but what's one key takeaway you hope people leave with today?
I'll let you jump in, Adam. I've been talking a lot.
Okay, yeah, I can go first. I mean, I think like this is going to take all of us, and so you know, how do we make sure we share this information about the issues, and then I mean, how do we make sure that people are getting involved and plugged in? And really, I mean, I think another major thing we need to work on as a community is figuring out, you know, access points to, you know, our systems and where we can make changes and adjustments that are connected to things that David's lifted up. So I think bringing more people in and really helping make it clearer, kind of what are our access points as a community related to making key changes that will create shifts. related to, economic mobility.
Yeah, I think that's great. And the thing I would add, just from Opportunity Insights perspective, we offered a lot of different slides and evidence and data and that sort of thing. I think I would have you take away the concluding slide, right? The different data tools that we have available that folks can use and explore to really understand the statistics that we talk through for your local community. And start to use those as a way to test your assumptions, right, around what economic mobility looks like within Forsyth County, the broader Winston-Salem area. Begin to explore how other characteristics within these tools, you can look at other metrics and outcomes. They're not prescriptive, right, in terms of what you should do necessarily, right? It's not going to tell you that you should implement a new early childhood education program in this neighborhood. But it does allow you to really understand and explore the factors contributing to rates of upward mobility and how they look different neighborhood by neighborhood. And as you do so, I think we're here as a resource, right? If you're really interested in this and want to dig into the data further, we're happy to continue to have conversations with you.
Well, thank you to both of our speakers. This hour went by so quickly. We also want to thank everyone who attended. We'll be sending out a link to our website, which will have the recording from today's webinar and resources so you can explore more data on economic mobility, read stories of impact, and connect with organizations driving change locally. So thank you all again and have a great afternoon.